Good evening. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. And we're here tonight for a book talk on this new book, Designing for Empathy, The Architecture of Connections in Learning Environments. First of all, thank you to the Center for Architecture for hosting us, and the two committees that are hosting us tonight, the Committee on the Environment and the Education Committee. My name is Julia van den Hout, and it was my pleasure to be the editor on this book, written by architect Aybars Aşçı. Tonight, we're going to dive into the intersection of architecture and developmental psychology. And the focus is on, I think, a concept that has been mentioned a lot in the last couple of years, but certainly now seems more important than ever, the concept or the notion of empathy. What if we can help foster empathy through architecture? Can we design spaces for empathy? We'll be discussing tonight how empathy can be integrated into the built environment, particularly in learning environments. But I hope our conversation will extend also beyond that, or at least take a broad understanding of what a learning environment ultimately is. How can architects and designers create spaces that not only function for their everyday programmatic needs, but also spaces that actively foster understanding, compassion, and connection between the people that use and occupy the space? Our featured book, Designing for Empathy, dives into this question. Aybars puts forth the idea that the design of schools can, in fact, be instrumental in fostering empathy from an early age. We're thrilled to have Aybars here. He's going to present on the book at the beginning, and then we're joined by a great panel of speakers to help us expand the conversation. Dr. Natalie Brito, Jeff Clark, and Sandi Lam Harder. I hope that our conversation will offer new perspectives of how we can shape the world to be more empathic, inclusive, and responsive to the human condition. So we'll begin with Aybars' presentation, and then I'll invite the speakers up and do a proper introduction. But first, to introduce Aybars. Architect and educator, he's an advocate for research-driven design with a notable focus on designing learning environments. His projects range from planning large-scale campuses, of which you'll see a little bit tonight, to designing play structures. As a practicing architect, he has over 25 years experience working both in New York and London on projects located in North America, South America, the Middle East, and Asia. As an educator, he has taught seminars and design studios at City College of New York, Cornell University, Pratt Institute, and Northeastern University. And he's even an inventor with a US patent for a high-performance enclosure system. He is the president and founder of Efficiency Lab for Architecture, a Brooklyn-based design practice. Aybars, with that, I welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everyone. Let's see. In 2016, I had an interesting meeting, which actually started the trajectory of this research. I met a group of educators that had a mission to redefine education in ways where they had a school of thought, and they were looking campuses across the world to represent that school of thought. And we often sort of joke that they had a software and they were looking for somebody to design the hardware for it. So I kind of became the hardware guy. And it was different than a normal commission that architects sort of get in ways where I wasn't really designing specific to a project, but I was designing specifics to a mission. And part of that mission, but a critical element of that mission was they wanted in their schools a key skill, empathy, measurable, that develops, and that's an important part of today's, especially today's world, to understand the perspective of the others, to understand other cultures, and to have a pluralistic worldview. So, and of course, then you ask yourself, how do you design for empathy? And that sort of set us off with, this whole, it became the book, but it's an ongoing research of what what this means. This is the contents of the book. The chapter 2, written by Dr. Julia Higdon, is really important for those of you that want to deep dive on empathy in the course of developmental psychology, from development of the individual to the larger sort of group, the issues around empathy as well, sort of its well depth, and there's a lot of references to read through. But first, let's just sort of dive into what is empathy and design. Do we encounter that in the design discourse? And one reference is a notable one by Juhana Pallasmaa in a book, Architecture and Empathy, and he discusses a notion of empathic imagination. And what empathic imagination is really something that architects, we do without even thinking. When we design, we imagine ourselves to be the user. Like we project ourselves into the lives of the others. And I'll give you an example. So I had this, fortunate commission to design a glass house in Telluride, Colorado. So I'm like, well, I always wanted to live in a glass house. And so I was imagining myself living into that, like looking into the boulders and looking, inside out spaces and opening. So I imagined myself as I was designing this. And so that's what Juhana Pallasmaa calls empathic imagination. Now, of course, the critique of that, you could say, is, well, it doesn't work for every typology. Well, not to say that this is not the only driver of design, but that kind of thinking doesn't work. Let's say if you're designing for 2-year-olds, like you're not going to imagine yourself how empathic you are. Or if you're designing, say, for a rehabilitation center for brain trauma, So in itself, it operates, in design practice, and that's fine, but it's not what we are, what this book is about, right? And of course, that critique, if you see that in participatory design, where a deeper community engagement you see in the planning world tries to bridge that gap between what the user is. But again, here the empathy is understood as you're trying to sort of be with the user or make the user the designer. So that kind of happens in the design process. Another reference in design and empathy comes from the sort of the product design user experience world, where empathic design is understood or defined as your relationship with a product. Let's just say that you have a shoe and you love it, it's so comfortable, and your friends wear the same shoe, so you have a social acceptance of that. Or the shoe has some ecological story, so it aligns with your environmental values, right? So these folks describe empathic design as your relationship to the product. So that's kind of in the consumer mindset. Again, that's not what we're talking here either. But that is another definition of empathy in the design world. But what really educators are talking about is like, in that sort of world, like how do you develop empathy with people? So how does, and then the question of course is like, well, does the space or the environment have any role in that? Now, if you read a lot of texts on developmental psychology will mention environment. There will be neighborhoods, there will be houses, there will be, the definition of the environment is omnipresent in that discourse, but the influence of it is less so. So how does that interact is sort of the trajectory of where we go. But before I go a little bit, I'm just going to project a little bit further back and just sort of define where empathy comes from. It's not actually a very old word in its discourse. If you trace it back to 1870s in aesthetics, in German formalism, and Robert Wischer described Einfühlung as feeling into, and in his definition of empathy it's an appreciation of nature or art is you feel into it. Like, for instance, he describes we like horizontal lines of the horizon because of our posture, right? So that's that sort of understanding of Einfühlung. And 20 years later, or about, Theodor Lipps wrote the theory of empathy in psychology. And there, first leap happened between empathy, rather being an appreciation of art or nature, to becoming empathy between people. And it got translated, and first English use of it traces around, again, the same kind of time with, in psychology and aesthetics. In aesthetic definition, it continues in art, Einfühlung, and there's lectures about it and whatnot. But what we are talking here mostly today is its use in sociology and linguistics, neuroscience. And one part with empathy also comes with is bias and identity. And I want to highlight that because it's important. Now, is empathy all good? No, it's not. It's actually what the empathy does is there are things we do. We make choices. We don't have empathy with everybody. We make empathy with people we choose. And that defines our identity. And with that, there are implicit biases. There is groups, in-groups and out-groups. And there is an interesting social experiment done in the 1950s. This is a very famous one, Robbers Cave experiment. And so in 1950s, social psychologists basically took 22 boys, roughly ages 11, 12, with similar backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, but the boys didn't know each other at all no prior knowledge. And they were split into two groups. They didn't know they were split into two groups. And the experiment or the study was done in 3 stages. In the first stage, they basically gathered together and had team building exercises. So there's that chemistry. So they were all part of the same team, right? So they were tent pitching, they went swimming. In fact, in one case, one of the boys that didn't know how to swim, with the encouragement of the other boy, learned how to swim. So that was a great example of what Lev Vygotsky would say, zone of proximal development, which is the boy there basically learned something that he wouldn't have done otherwise by himself. So that social aspect of learning, that empathy that was happening in that group was uplifting. So they formed an in-group identity in such ways that they actually named themselves and they decided to make a flag. And when people start hanging flags where trouble is around the corner. And the next phase of the study is they introduced the second group, because second group independently went through similar team building exercises. And now the groups are competing against each other with sort of really heavily competitive games like tug of war. So then the conflict starts, first verbally, then we see this, right? So then they start beating each other. So this is kind of our default mode, right? We develop empathy quickly and we build our group, even though in this case, the kids have no backgrounds that should conflict with each other other than whatever they build in that 1 week, right? And what's interesting is actually this experiment was repeated in the Middle East with backgrounds of, conflicting backgrounds. And interestingly, the groups were formed and the fights happened abstractly because of the groups, not because of their backgrounds. So this is how easily we could sort of manipulate and create that sort of high-rolling empathy with each other. Now, when we talk about empathy, especially in this sort of age of echo chambers and sort of hearing the thoughts that we like to hear, it's not the empathy with the people that we think or share the same narratives as we do. It's actually our ability to build empathy with the people that we don't. And that is hard. And there is cognitive burden there that we need to swim through, right? That's not our default mode. Our default mode is to project it back to ourselves, and I'll talk a little bit about defaults. So coming back to Theodore Lips's definition, so we see empathy as a primary epistemic means of gaining knowledge of other minds. So it is really important that's how we can build a pluralistic understanding if we have to go through that. And how do we do that is we do that through perspective taking. We need to take the perspective of the other. And this is both an emotional and a cognitive exercise. And chapter 3. The book starts, and this is the most important chapter. If you want to read only one chapter, read Julia's chapter, which is chapter 2. But if you want to read another chapter, you can read this one. So what is deixis? So deixis is the first type of language we learn. That's the four, when you watch a toddler, 2 years old, they're pointing, right? Before they learn anything, they're talking. And how they talk is through pointing. That's their first language. That's how we learn. And then we translate that to, let's say, to English, right? And they become diacritic words, right? When I say this or I, that's a diacritic word. And they're classified. For instance, personal diacrisis is like I, me, we, you. Or it could be space diacrisis, which is this and that. Or it could be time diacrisis. It's now, yesterday, today, what have you. But one of the interesting things about diacritic words is, unlike, let's just say, paper, whether this paper here or there, paper is paper, but this changes if that becomes that, right? So it is contextual. And why does that matter? Well, we'll get to that. So if we go to linguistics, to the pragmatics of linguistics, this diagram is based on Stephen Levinson's lectures on diaxes. So dialectic center is a geometric construct, and architects could relate to this right away. Right? I mean, so there is an anchor point. The language is anchored to the person that is talking, right? And keep that thought in mind, because I'm going to keep coming back to the dialectic center as we talk. So there was an interesting study that was done by psycholinguists on how children acquire dialectic terms. And they realized that they had trouble in identifying the dialectic depth, they call this and that. So when the object was further away, they would still call it this, even though the object was that. Or when I was talking to, let's say, Natalie, I would say I instead of I say you. Because they lacked the dialectic depth, meaning that they collapsed everything back to themselves, back to, remember, that anchor point. So for them, everything sort of, like it was almost a flat world without the dialectic depth. And, you know, in their sort of study, they realized subsequently the children sort of learn the depth, the dialectic depth, and they start to understand the difference between this, that, and started to identify that. But, you know, this is an interesting spatial conjecture, which I call it the three niches conjecture. So we experimented this idea that if we were to build a space that is purpose-built, that actually has three dialectic centers that are in parallel on the same dialectic axis, so this would nudge the students or the young children as they acquire the dialectic depth, that not only that there exists a dialectic depth, because they would see the mirror of it, but they would also realize that in their dialectic depth, there is other anchor points. So there is another first person there. There is another first person there. So they are not the only first person in the conversation. In other words, the narrative is not just anchored to them. And that's an important realization. So if you can say, as you're acquiring language with the awareness of other, that sort of starts to change the narrative. So this was basically some pictures from the what we call the three niches conjecture. I'm not going to get into all the discourse around conjectures, but there is a chapter in the book that talks about why we call these conjectures. Now, in the spatial narrative, which I just described, the spatial cognition is anchored to two frames of references, roughly. One is an egocentric frame of reference, which means that when I speak, I can anchor the entire narrative to myself, and we know how that is done these days, right? The difficult one is to have an allocentric frame of reference, which is an external one, which means that I construct the narrative, not anchoring back to myself, but by relationship to other things, right? So in order to develop empathy, remember what I said, like it's easy for us to be empathy with the people we like, harder with others, to move away from our egocentric perspective to a more allocentric frame of reference so we can be more inclusive. So we can understand the narrative. And I keep referring to a narrative because that's important, part of the argument in the book, right? You could take that to other disciplines. But I do believe that the semantics that is formed through this is going to define how we speak, how we express ourselves, right? So, but my critique with this sort of dialogue between egocentric and allocentric is that when you even look at the allocentric frame of reference, there is still a bias. And the bias of that is contextual. Now let me give you an example. So for instance, if I were to describe the political environment of today, right, even if I speak in as best effort as I can do with being allocentric as possible, I can, I am still in the bias of context and time. So I can't take myself out of that narrative, right? So we experimented with this idea that what if there was another spatial frame of reference, which I call an isocentric frame of reference, within which the narrative is not constructed by the human being, but it's constructed by an object through multiple narratives. Now, I'm going to give you an example. That's easier to comprehend with that one. And, well, we know what this is. It's a piece of Berlin Wall. And it's at Berry Park City, downtown Manhattan. You can just walk by it without recognizing it. And, you know, it just sits there. And at some point, about several years ago, Berry Park City Authority, concerned about the paint deterioration, you know, issued an RFP to architects to say, just created some kind of shelter. So we were interested because the question was really interesting, right? Well, what does that mean? Like, how do paint restoration, and what kind of an object is this? What is it saying to us? And I mean, obviously, it's the most, you know, known artifact of the Cold War. You know, it wasn't just a wall, it was a series of walls and ditches and, you know, vehicle traps, and actually there was a zone called the dead zone. And the murals painted by Terry Noir in 1980s in ways where he was doing this really quickly not to get caught by the border guards. So he kind of created his style of minimalism through like basically the pragmatic ease of like not to being captured. But his was a defiance. His was a subversion of a Cold War apparatus into a humanistic canvas, right? And what he said doing this act is that while doing that subversion, he felt he was stronger than the wall. Now, I mean, that's pretty poetic, like, right, at that sort of transformation. But then I asked myself, well, what is it doing down here next to an apartment building surrounded by a picket fence, right? I mean, so in that sort of sense, how do we relate to it? And how can we create narratives that could sort of get us out of that Cold War context back to the context that we are in, or to the context that could happen other times, right? So we created this isocentric frame of reference, and somewhat washed out, but you could see that. So we created a spatial apparatus that put this fragment on multiple dialectic centers. And not only that, we also created, in my computer, it actually is this working? All right. So this A is actually a frame. This imagine is shaded, right? So we just created another plane where another form of subversion could happen, right? So another artist could paint over Noir's painting, but in an ever-changing way. So in the perspectival axis of every person, there is another plane of reference. Well, let me show you one we created ourselves. I'm going to read this one. It's easier. I don't want to improvise. Hold on. This is aging. This slide shows one of the perspectives of the wall juxtaposed by the image and the story of the Syrian refugees trying to cross the Aegean Sea on makeshift boats in 2015. In this particular image, we see a little boy who tragically drowned and washed out to the beach. The eye of the mural is looking towards us as we look back at it. And there is the little boy, lying motionless on our dialectic axis. In this juxtaposition, Noir's drawing of the big eye is looking at the little boy, witnessing another human tragedy on another death strip. We can see another juxtaposition, the lips of the mural framed over a new story of the tragedy. In this narrative, the bright red lips are motionless. The person reading this is reminded of the importance of her own voice. The mural reminds us that we have a responsibility to speak up and to act against atrocities. The person looking at these juxtapositions is encouraged to think of this segment of Berlin Wall not as a relic from the past, but as a reminder that human tragedies continue to unfold and peaceful coexistence of societies is contingent on fragile balances. These balances depend on perpetual emotional and cognitive empathy for each other as much as they depend on international treaties and protocols. Sorry, I had to put my glasses back on. Chapter 4 deals with movement and empathy, because movement is really important in early learning. And it starts with the body. And the discourse around bodies is well kind of taught in architecture. Here's the Vitruvian man. Here is the Corbusier's modular man. They're all men. They're all, you know, perfect, probably white. And there's a lot of that conversation. But what is that it's also an adult person, right? But what happens to this guy here, right? Because what happens is this is how we actually discover when we are young through our bodies. And there is a form of discovery, a spatial exploration called insertion. So as the children develop their sensory motor skills, they actually stick their fingers in, stick their bodies in. There is that sort of tactile and real kind of engagement as they discover the world, right? So imagine their sort of little egocentric centers moving around and just sort of banging around the things. So they have that sort of sense of development, which is really important, but there's also that sense of mirroring or sense of repetition, looking at others. And there's that sort of social aspect of their development that is just starting. Like as they discover the world, they discover that they're not alone, they're like repeating each other. So that sort of transformation from individual exploration to spatial, sort of to social learning becomes really important. So, you know, like that versus in more architectural terms, maybe it's a transformation from niches to forums, right? So then we sort of, and the book sort of deviates here into a whole kind of analytical world about how we design forums and circulation. So I'll just give a few examples of that. So we actually simulated behavior and how we can create forums in our sort of the schoolwork that we have done with Avenues and others in terms of campus design, quads, and how do people move? How can we create environments that sort of catalyze social gathering, right? And what's kind of interesting about this is that the underlying principle is what's called the social force model. What moves these agents in the sort of the simulation. And that social force model, again, it just gets really detailed down there, but it's interesting that it has actually some resemblance to what the language model talks about the didactic center. So in one way to realize or see that motion is actually you can think about it as the social force model as the didactic center in motion, right? Not just people are moving, and the narrative is moving. And one thing that we did, which is kind of, I think, really interesting, is we started mapping that narrative instead of mapping the movement in ways where you could see that there, that's called vision time surface. We're basically mapping where the individual is looking at as they are moving in space, right? How is their depth of didactic depth is sort of defined. And, you know, and then we kind of put them in labyrinths because that's where you're making choices. We kind of wanted to understand how choice architecture affects the narrative. And we also even did a kind of a small experiment of like how we can actually erode the architecture with the narrative of the movement. And then we applied this to a warehouse conversion to school where we just took the idea of movement and social learning and said that we could convert that into a series of movement analyses and ways that the students can move through these labyrinthine spaces to create a multi-level social learning environment where the sort of interactions go in. I am sort of staying in somewhat on a really kind of high level on this chapter because I want to get time with my distinguished panelists here. So I'm going to just breeze through play and empathy, and then I'll be done. Play obviously is super important in learning environments. So there's all of, you know, this goes in. And one thing, if you want to like think about that, is play is serious business for children. That's how they learn, right? It only becomes work and play for us. That's where we actually miss the boat on the importance of play, when we bifurcate, right? So why? Because we start to think that when we play, we're not working. Play is not serious. But for the children, it is serious. So, which means that play is an important agency of change, right? And if we want to go from our default mode of being egocentric, being, you know, empathy with the people we like, we need to get out of that. And getting out of that cognitive burden requires us to play. And this one just deals with nature. And, you know, obviously for children, nature is not, you know, like how we see nature. Anything that moves is living, whether it's a caterpillar or a bicycle or a garbage truck. That's all has life in them, right? So they are not categorical. So in that sense, we don't always get this beautiful kindergarten. Sometimes we get this as the schoolyard. And, you know, people that deal with place-based learning, they deal with, or the, you know, environment as the integrating context or situated learning discourse that says, well, you need to integrate the school not as an institution, but into its context in some ways that is so merging that, that sort of deserves these interactions to happen. Now, this is one example. This is a site in Shenzhen. It's an urban village. That was all industrial buildings and warehouses, which we converted to a K-12 campus. But like they were like these types of structures where we basically transformed them with the idea that we wanted to sort of create, and part of this is all early learning, we wanted to create this sort of connection with nature. And interestingly, in this sort of roof canopy we designed, like the design was inspired almost going back to the original definition of empathy as Einfühlung, where the relationship between nature and what's made, where the catenary curves that were supporting the cable net structure did sort of a counter to the mountains profile, where that relationship of the playground sort of is defined by these views, or in this case, the notions of biophilic design, which of course is great. We should all kind of include that, but not just, it cleans the air, it's kind of nice to, but it also like creates these sub-narratives where you can just say, hey, it's not just nature and human-made, like as if, we can't always go out to the kindergartens out in the forest, but like there's that sort of hybrid conditions where we have relationship with the ambassadors of nature, which I like to call, and like things like this, that transforming them into these hybrid spaces that becomes really powerful in trying to look for these opportunities. This is, these are all banyan trees, my favorite kind of tree, because of how hybrid it is. So we created these vertical playgrounds. It's both a bridge that connects different campus levels, but also a way that the children could play around. And again, coming back, that they could see the banyan tree in multiple perspectives, right? So the narrative of the nature is within their view, whether it's its trunks or its branches or its canopy. So they sort of play around, and the structure doesn't try to look like the tree, but it becomes basically an armature to frame the tree. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Aybars, for giving us the overview of the book. And as you've probably noticed, we do have the books up front here if anybody's interested in taking a look at a copy or maybe purchasing it. And so to further explore the threads that are presented in the book, we're joined by 3 additional speakers. Natalie Brito is a developmental psychologist who examines how early social and cultural contexts shape the trajectory of neurocognitive development, with the goal of better understanding how best to support caregivers and create environments that foster healthy child development. Specifically, her work examines links between the early home environment and the development of attention, memory, and socio-emotional skills during the first 3 years of life. Natalie is an associate professor of applied psychology at NYU, and prior to joining the NYU faculty, she spent 2 years as Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholars and 2 years as a postdoctoral research fellow within the Division of Developmental Neuroscience at Columbia University Medical Center. Our second speaker is Jeff Clark. An innovative and forward-looking education leader. Jeff brings 25 years of experience to AIANY Learning Sciences, which is a newly formed organization by key members of Avenues, the World School team, which Jeff led for more than a decade. AIANY Learning Sciences is comprised of 3 groups. Beyond providing transformative learning experiences for a growing number of students at AIANY School, its school-to-school group is dedicated to offering cutting-edge leading learning technologies for schools around the world, while its TigerWorks R&D team pioneers impactful solutions. As I mentioned, Jeff served as president of Avenues, the World School, for 11 years, leading its growth from 700 students in one campus to more than 4,000 students at 5 interconnected and interdependent campuses around the world. Before joining Avenues, Jeff served for 7 years as president and CEO of National Heritage Academies, or NHA, one of the largest K-8 education management organizations in the US, and which serves more than 55,000 students at nearly 90 public charter schools in 9 states. And under Jeff's leadership, the NHA opened more than 20 new schools and had 100% of its charters renewed and significantly improved student learning outcomes. And our third speaker is Sandi Lam Harder, head of WorkShape Labs, the research and experimentation arm of WorkShape, a research-based creative agency that helps teams get the most out of getting together. She's a licensed architect and San Francisco-based consultant specializing in the intersection of people and places. She's practiced in Chicago and Seattle, working on projects spanning transportation, commercial, cultural, and workplace sectors. And she's recognized the importance of aligning project purpose with design, operation, and policy, which led her to an internal workplace role in tech, managing global design and construction projects, and leading workplace strategy programs. Her career is dedicated to implementing strategies that support the highest potential of the built environment. Thank you all for joining us, and so I'll invite you to come up front, please. Okay, is that on? Okay. So we have 4 microphones, 5 speakers. Grab one whenever you want. And so Natalie actually would love to start with you because I'm assuming that most of the people in the audience are architecture related. Shout out if that's not a true assessment. But I'd love if you could give us a better understanding of empathy from a human development perspective. You know, your research focuses on how early experiences shape brain development. So in what way do you think that the physical environment, such as the spaces where children learn, influence empathy and cognitive development? And are there any particular environmental factors that can enhance or maybe hinder that process?
So I think that's a whole dissertation, but I will try to answer piecemeal, I guess. So, you know, I study how, you know, brain and behavior kind of develop in the first couple years of life. And so when I was reading through the book, you know, it really gave me a lot of different perspective on my own field. And so I study primarily infants and caregivers, and so I think about social connection a lot. I don't study empathy, but I think about social connection. And brain development early in life is driven by social connections. The neural connections in our brain need social interactions. And so when I think about empathy, I also think about, you know, the affordances that children have. So in developmental psychology, affordances are the functional possibilities granted to an object, or in this case, an environment or a space, relative to a child, right? So when you think about the home environment or a space, thinking about it from the child's perspective, like an infant is motorically limited, right? They can't move, they can't self-locomote, they can barely hold up their head as a newborn. And so when you put an infant down, what are they looking at in that space? Probably the ceiling. You know, to look at caregivers, they need to have proximity. You think about toddlers, it's, you know, they start to be able to move. They have their own motivations. For any parents here, you know that you try to get them to pay attention to one thing. They're not going to pay attention to that one thing. They're going to look at everything else. But when we think about designing space that elicit empathy, I think you have to think about it from the perspective of the child. And that's kind of, you know, being on the ground, being at the level that, you know, is going to elicit that social connection, that social interaction with their caregivers, at least in my field. So I think those are, you know, the elements or aspects of the space or the home environment that really come to mind when I think, how do we kind of increase empathy or social connection for families, I guess.
This is a nice way to dive into this subtitle of the book, which is The Architecture of Connections. Because while the book is largely focused on learning environments, again, let's take a broad definition of that. That is a concept I think can certainly be extended to offices. Sandi, thinking of your work, and kind of in what type of spaces do we continue to learn, and what is the importance, even kind of on an adult level, of connection?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for having me here. I think it's such a testament, like having a diverse panel is such a testament to how relevant this topic is, and that this book is really, getting into all these different types of spaces. So I work in workspace, which means a lot of different things these days, especially since COVID brought us all virtual. That also means a lot of hybrid working, and connection's a hot topic. How do we get collaboration? How do we get innovation from our different workspaces? And I think, to your point, learning environments, when I read this book, I read it through the lens of how do we do this for adults? How do we engage the play drive for adults? Because everything that we do for children to get them to understand the world better, to use their imagination, we need to do that for adults. To me, it's very obvious, the connection.
I was gonna dive in, the last sort of, I guess the exploration in the last 10 years or so in the workspace sort of almost brought that playfulness that was absent decades ago, where, talk about work was like really much more sterile place.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely ball pits, and there's swing sets and those types of things, especially where I'm based in the Bay Area. But I think some of these concepts that Aybars talks about in the book, about the banyan trees, blurring the lines between this space and that space, and it kind of encouraging your mind to think about what are the possibilities. Those sorts of nudges. That's definitely something that I want to see more of in the office space. I've been a part of some great projects where there's long corridors, and we've built out spaces for people to just have breakout sessions right as they're walking down the corridor, which is great. I think we need to see more of that.
Obviously, COVID was a big moment, both for work and for education and the world. But that, the impact of that on this sense of connection between people and how that impacted empathy is a huge marker. And obviously, thanks to technology, even though we were physically isolated, through technology we could have that visual connection. I'm curious, Aybars, maybe you can talk about empathy and this idea of the importance of perspective taking, but that the difference between physical and visual proximity in that.
I'm going to take an analog take on this for a minute, right? So the other day I was at a dance performance, and I was talking to the dance enthusiasm and modern dance performance. One of the things I like about modern dance is it kind of reminds me how important proprioception is, how important we define space through movement from our bodies, right? One of the things that we overdo is visual, like looking at virtual cameras. One of the most disorienting thing I find when I look at those simulators is that sort of lack of my body in the space, and because of that, I'm missing out something on that, right? So, to me, there is that sort of being present in like that physicality and that sort of analog space is important. Not to say that digital one isn't, but I think that the digital one shouldn't be a representation of that in ways where we sacrifice certain qualities. Like, let's just say in the case of we don't have our body in the space, it should be a different type. And I haven't really seen a convincing one to say that that is a different mode of representation that enhances, let's just say, my empathy. I mean, I see that in literature, right? Like by reading, like, or I guess you can say that in film, but like it's harder to say that I'm in a Zoom call and I'm really having like empathies coming off my ears because like that just, you know, that sort of isn't really, that distance is real for me. But maybe.
Well, I would just add, there have been a couple studies that looked at the use of Zoom with grandparents and children, and that does foster a lot of connection, but I do think it matters what you're doing behind the screen, right? So Zoom calls are a perfect example. You're just sitting there, you're just talking to another person. But grandparents can play with their kids on Zoom, you know? So I think Zoom is it's the medium, but it's kind of what you do behind the scenes that really could foster that. And so maybe even in Zoom calls, if we can facilitate some sort of better physical interaction, that actually might increase some sort of connection.
As the parent of a young child and with grandparents far away, my parents will be very happy to hear that, I think. Jeff, for you, how has the pandemic, how does that, and how we think about educational spaces, how has your understanding of empathy in learning environments changed with remote learning and kind of a hybrid model?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in the newest iteration of AIANY, we're very focused in digital spaces, and I think we think a lot about what is purpose-built space look like, and so in a digital environment, that's different than a physical environment. But a lot of it comes back to what Aybars was saying in the beginning: is what are the goals? So particularly in learning environments, for a long time in education. The real goal was more on crystallized intelligence, meaning that I wanted to teach you something and I wanted to know if you learned it. I think, and that was pragmatic for a certain point in time in education. I hope that education is actually evolving and that what our goals was to not only foster growth in crystallized intelligence, but also in fluid intelligence. And fluid intelligence is the ability to approach novel problems or something you haven't seen before and how you might work through solutions there. And we think that is as important as crystallized intelligence in a go-forward environment. Empathy is an important component of fluid intelligence, but for probably too long, schools were not purpose-built for fluid intelligence. They are purpose-built for crystallized intelligence. And if you have to add both now, what do those environments look like? What do the physical spaces look like? What do the digital spaces look like if that is your goal? So, you know, I think that our learnings have been first define the purpose. What are the goals of the spaces that you're designing? Because that drives what it is. You can tell that we are very lucky to work with Aybars and that he is very thoughtful about how we're approaching these type of spaces and was a great partner with us in it. But I think what transformed some of it is first putting forth the goal that empathy was an objective as opposed to being something on the side. And so I think looking at all environments, whether it be a workspace, being very intentional about what the desired outcomes are at the end has to be the first ingredient in saying what does the space look like or what is it meant to do. Because you won't find very many curriculums around the world that has empathy as a goal. We put that in there because that's partly what we were trying to solve for, which changed the assignment. So you can't design for empathy unless empathy is an actual goal.
Do you find in education that virtual realm starts to really be a design, kind of almost like a physical space? Like, Sandy and I were talking earlier about how a lot of the co-working, the virtual co-working models are starting to really be design spaces, virtual spaces, where you can move through a different room and you can opt for different type of meeting spaces, like a casual meeting space where anybody can join, or kind of a closed space where the room is locked. But we're starting to use the same type of language to describe those virtual spaces as we are kind of the real built spaces. With educational hybrid models or digital learning models, are you seeing the same kind of designed environment of those?
Not yet, which is the reason we built our own. So we had to build our own digital spaces really for what we thought was great learning. We were fortunate that we were already on that endeavor before COVID, so we had some things to do during that environment. I think one of the key learnings within learning spaces that was found is that it's a lot easier to replicate a digital learning space in a physical environment than it is a physical environment in a digital space. So I think, again, it also has a lot to do with the difference between, I think, user-centered design and user-designed. Even I told Aybars I wouldn't go too far on this, but like you saw the participatory workshops. I mean, that's an attempt at it, I think, in our opinion. But it's really not getting where you need to be. And that's why the perspective-taking chapter, I think, is so important, not just because my colleague co-authored it with Aybars, but it's not about asking people what they want. It's about putting yourself in their shoes and being able to take a perspective from your own expert point of view. Because if you just survey people in a certain setting, that's more user designed, and you're likely to get something that is going to be very uninspiring. But if you take a user-centered perspective, that I understand I'm designing something for a 2-year-old, even though I can't exactly think like a 2-year-old, you might end up with something like some of the play structures that you saw there, some of those other elements.
But I think this is a big point that the book doesn't delve into that much, actually. You mentioned it very briefly at the beginning, but the difference between designing with empathy and the designing for empathy. The idea that a space can be an active agent in how we learn, how we create social connections, that can have agency. Why is that not something that architects are? Why is that not an active conversation within architecture? Sorry, tough question.
Yes. I don't want shoes getting combined with my colleagues. Well, I mean, I think the critique, maybe Palasma's critique was sort of like on this topic. He said, like, one of the reasons empathy isn't as kind of a territory that's not walked as much in architecture is it's hard to talk about behavior. It's just too, it's difficult. The vocabulary is difficult. Measuring it could be, hard. And frankly, the way we work is sort of like, even if you just say, okay, there's post-occupancy surveys and whatnot, it's sort of limited, right? You sort of finish the building, you get out of it pretty much, right? Like that, sort of trying to sort of go into that in a meaningful way, like you almost need to define the role of the architect a little bit. Like in a traditional sort of setup, it's harder to achieve, right? I mean, that I was kind of lucky in that sense because we weren't designing a project, but it was just like we were going after how can we design for empathy, right? I mean, that was the kind of the thing that was in my mind, my team's mind, like as we were exploring that. That's a bit of a different, the definition of the problem is different. It's hard to do that if it was a singular project where you can sort of punch it and it might be beautiful. You can go back there and see how people are acting, but you're not going to go there every day, every month. It's 4 years later, 3 years later, like talk to the educator constantly. You're not going to do that. I mean, it will be, if you do that, it will be very unusual, but that would be great, right? So that would be one sort of part of, I guess that's one part of the way that the architecture sort of discipline is set up that is limiting.
Yeah, not being an architect, I don't know if this is true, but what I can tell you from an education perspective, even in the last, couple decades, people have understood that intelligence and empathy can change. And so there were perhaps assumptions get in the way of sometimes. So if you think that empathy is immovable and not malleable, right, why design for it? We now definitely understand that intelligence, like an IQ, we can get into all this stuff you can do a much better job than me, but looking at somebody as static is a false premise. And so I think looking at and designing for humans as ever-changing could be a different premise to begin with, as opposed to thinking about humans are static and therefore their spaces need to be static to support who they are today. Our hope would certainly be that learning is lifelong. So it's not only in this K-12 environment or nursery through 12 environment or beyond that is you're designing workspaces. How does that promote additional learning and learnings, and particularly when that is changeable?
Yeah, and I think to answer that question, it's just hard to measure. It's just hard. And I think people want something tangible. And it's easier to say we've designed with empathy in a participatory process than it is to say this space actually fosters and encourages the development of empathy. And I see it the same as designing a space that is better for creativity or better for psychological safety. That's really hard to measure too. So you can ask people, do you feel more psychologically safe in this space? Do you feel more creative? And that perception is one thing that you can take down, but then are there other metrics that can help us understand whether that's true? I think that, there are some that we can certainly try to put it against, do we have the same amount of people, what's the percentage of people talking in a meeting? Maybe that gives us some indicator of whether or not there's psychological safety on this team. But
Actually, I'm just going to jump into that,
Yeah.
because there is that whole Harkness table exercise, which we almost completed, but there's almost. So the Harkness method is, for those of you that may not be familiar, it's just basically discussion-based learning, and it's sort of designed around an elliptical table, and that's the Harkness table, right? It's an elliptical table, right? But if you make it too attenuated, it becomes one of those state kind of things where there's A and the B, right? Like there's the Chinese delegation and the American delegation sitting, right? So there's a scale to the Harkness table, right, of interaction. And what is interesting about the Harkness method of learning is that the teacher's role there is not it's actually take notes and moderate discussion and create diagrams, like neural network diagrams, of who is talking to who, right? So you get these sort of charts of diagrams at the end of the discussion. So that way, that's in some ways a measurable way that you could see how is the conversation going on between who's talking more and what's the map of the conversation, right? So of course for architects it's oh great, that's right there. I see the lines. Can I can I take the Harkness table and start playing with that? Would that playing with certain parts of it, and instead of seeing it just a table, seeing it a full room? So we were almost at the cusp of doing that, and also implementing some measurement techniques to see rather than just doing it by hand, you can sort of digitally kind of map the sort of the neural network of the discussion. So to me, that's a good example of how you can kind of substantiate.
yeah, and I think, so this is going to turn into a total he said, she said, because I don't remember where this came from, but so I think there was a study where these people were talking on Zoom versus in person, and then later one of those people dropped their pen in the hallway or something, and then they studied how often that person went to pick it up. So people were more apt to pick up the pen for the people they had met in person. And so it's one of those things, how can we measure the empathy part whenever they go through these spaces that have more perspective taking, more vantages. And I think, I would love to put some of these things to the test. Natalie.
the thing I'd continue on the Harkness table, just to complete the thought. I mean, the way that Aybars helped us rethink it, right? The whole point of a Harkness table is there's no front of a classroom. Everybody's sitting around a table, discussion-based pedagogical approach, so that each is challenging each other kind of from an equal point of view. But it's done through a table, through a furniture solution in a square box that definitely has a front of the room and everything else. So what we started to reimagine is how could that be, instead of just a furniture solution, how could you have a whole classroom solution that matched the table and supported the idea of what that could look like. So we didn't get all the way to implementation yet. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity, but it's just like rethinking each of those assumptions of, again, what is the goal? If you're gonna have purpose designed spaces, you first have to understand the goals. And I think probably what is lacking is empathy is too often, and other type of fluid intelligence type things are too often not the goal that outweighed for some more predominant goal.
Natalie, I am curious to get from your perspective if you see a path to kind of more of a quantitative research from your end.
I do now, but yeah, that was the hook. Yeah, I mean, even just in our previous conversation together, and then just hearing kind of your thoughts, you know, I come from a world where you know, I use the scientific method, and I am designing studies and testing them out. And so it's much more rigid in thinking, which then I really do appreciate being in spaces where we're not trying to incrementally move science, you know, towards the future, and trying to make these larger leaps. And so I do think that coming together, you know, with scientists who think a lot about psychometrics and measurement. You know, what is empathy? How are we measuring it? What are the behaviors? But then also adding on the like social sciences of it, you know, on how is that person thinking that day, and how is that even contributing to the empathy that they might give to somebody else, you know? So thinking about these multiple layers together, I think is the way forward. And then for me, I get really excited because I do think about home environments, but not in this way at all. And so just even thinking about like, okay, if I were in a family's home, like how is that organized, or what pieces of furniture is really eliciting social interactions? And even when I come in, I do a lot of home-based studies. So, you know, especially post-COVID, families are very much hesitant to come to universities now just because there's a lack of time. Lots of communities also don't have a lot of trust in large institutions, even like NYU. And so because I work with a lot of diverse sociodemographic families, we go to homes and apartments, and we're invited into their space. And now I'm even thinking about, well, how am I even experimenting in that space, and how is that different, you know? So yeah, I definitely see a way forward. I think it involves a lot of conversations and trial and error, really.
We've been so focused on what are the things that can positively foster empathy. Do any of you have ideas of things that can impede? Just to flip the script, what are the bad things in a space?
It's easy to talk about how things can go wrong with empathy. I mean, it's just, I was just showing. I mean, because, you know, like, I mean, the discussions that I have had with people that, you know, that was my journey in the last 8 years, right? Like, once you sort of start thinking about this topic, you see that we have defaults. Like, our cognitive defaults is like, you know, like, it's hard to kind of break our patterns. And we do them unconsciously, like our biases, right? I mean, however, you know, enlightened we are, it's so difficult to break that and get to the other side. You know, again, like that's why I show the rubber scale experiment, which is, you know, today you can't do that, by the way, but like you can't even call it experiment, right? You can call it a study. But like in that, right, well, you can see like how easy like that sort of turned into kind of violence, right? So I think my argument in all of it across was that, and I'm going to tie it to the conjecture things, that I just put these as conjectures, right? And that's important to state, right? And as in, conjectures as is defined as, in the scientific conjectures, where you're basically putting it out as an invention, and it's not a digest of observation. It's actually, you boldly put it there for trial. And it could be refuted, or it could be, not, right? So like these conjectures aren't like, again, like digest of observations in like surveys and whatnot. They're actually ideas that were put in this sort of theoretical framework. And the objective to that framework was like, look, how can we, in a society, like Avenue set this goal to create the world leaders in a, in a society that we live. Look, well, you need to understand the other side and all other sides. You need to be able to understand the pluralistic worldview, and that requires that you have to go through that cognitive burden. And that's the nudge. And the space could do the nudge. Like space can only do the nudge. And that's the theory of it. It may succeed or not, but at least it's sort of offering the nudge in the case of like the three niches conjecture, right? Like we're suggesting that the children already have that dialectic depth development as part of their stages of, development, right? So if you can actually use the perspectival construct, which I call it the geometry of empathy, so to speak, right? That's more architecturally digestible. And if you can sort of nudge that perception, you might be able to like help the cognitive burden a little bit. You may not be able to get to the other side, but maybe you will.
Yeah, I love that. And I think to test these conjectures, we have to be sharing space together. Like it has to be our embodied people need to be sharing a space together. So I think something that could hinder putting it to the test is living our lives online too much. I mean, it's when we are seeing each other only through Zoom boxes, and not actually sharing space and moving with our bodies and seeing these different things, that I think that totally hinders.
I mean, I would posit that if you can increase empathy, you must be able to decrease it as well. So we can think about some of the things that increase empathy. Like we published a paper and did some original research on some perspective taking through writing prompts, actually. So like an example would be that we gave students that actually showed it would change empathy, would imagine how a taxi driver might view Uber. How would Uber view a taxi driver? How do you, as a New York City consumer, look at both? You specifically give prompts and ask students to look at something. My guess is that the opposite type of experiment would only be in asking you to constantly look through your own eyes at the world. It probably decreases empathy over time. So, I think it's a great question, but my guess is we know a little bit about what increases empathy. The converse probably does damage in that. And from a built space environment, one of the reasons we try to pay so much attention to it is in like a child's developmental years, right, from 2 to 18. About 50% of their waking hours are going to be in their home. About 30% of their waking hours are going to be in school. So that's a large part of it. And so we wanted to really put forth the effort to think about how each element of an education and their development would be impacted.
I just also wanted to add, thinking about constraining empathy, right? So I don't think about it in decreasing empathy, but constraining it. From the child's perspective, I think of two things, nature and stress, right? So we know that being in nature is actually really good for your brain, right? And so if we're constantly designing spaces that are indoors and you don't see kind of the nature component or being outside, I think that can constrain empathy. And then stress is always going to constrain empathy, but from an educational standpoint, there's lots of really great studies showing that exercise and recess is probably the best thing that you can do to increase academic achievement. And we think about play increasing empathy. And a lot of scientists think, well, recess helps with brain development or academic achievement because of cardiovascular health. And I do think that's true, but a lot of those studies don't actually measure what they're doing during recess, right? Like, are they using imaginative play? Are they running around because they're pretending that they're superheroes? Are they shifting their perspective? And so I think you could decrease stress within those educational experiences as also a way to increase empathy, or at least lift the constraints upon it too.
Since we now know the importance of all being together, I want to see if anybody in the audience has a question.
I think last thing you said really was interesting to me because I think when I look at all the architectural works we deal with and in the city, when I look at the education environments, it is really interesting how to create a positive space for kids that decrease the stress. Because I agree, I think when the stress level goes down, then you're more open to listen to someone else, your peers. So I'd have to create an environment that really, I think, it's not just kind of creating environments that there's a lot of interaction, but maybe also kind of like more therapeutic, more meditative, so that because you can't always interact. Like my son went to a German school where their classroom layout was more like round tables, and it was amazing because it worked out. Like they were kind of round the table, a lot of interaction. But when his friends changed, another friend came who was very dominant, it was quite stressful. So like suddenly that, so there was, he just wanted to put the blinders on all the time. So it's like how to, I think that's a quite interesting way of looking at it. I think sometimes creating those spaces in an educational environment where kids can sort of like be by themselves a little bit more isolated from students, so they can compress or so how to then come back to the environment and then be more open to stimulation. So that was interesting. I don't think it was a question, but I was wondering like how to like bring that to like maybe not just just education environment, but to everyday, to to every space that we actually live in. I think that's a challenge. I wonder what Aybars would think about that.
That became a question. I was I thought you were going to continue, Lisa. What was the question?
So like how to I think the designing for empathy for educational environment. I think it's like you kind of like work with some certain elements, but how to kind of like reflect that to like kind of like our everyday lives, like how would be
I guess
translation of that.
yeah, for me it was more of an intellectual journey, right? I mean, like and that's why I actually didn't even use the education. I said learning environments, right? Because to me there is a big, again, I kind of want to like not constrain it to like the school per se. And then when I say school, maybe like more that the old school definition of school, right? I mean, there are like this whole concepts about situated learning, like masteries, right? I mean, like there is a great book by Jan Levy that deals with situated learning, and she did a whole survey at the Liberian tailor shops, right? I think that she kind of looked at how people learn in those tailor shops. So that become the mastery idea. And actually we did work on a sort of idea of a mastery academy. So to me, it's more learning, like to just so that, and that sort of could be any sphere of life. But this journey, I was talking to my colleague on the train, this idea, so now I apply it to myself in this journey, like where every time I think of something, I pause and try to think what the other person would think. I mean, it is an effort. Like I realize, like in like certain circumstances, I try to do this intentionally now. Like that's nothing special, actually. It's just, you know, I feel like that is a skill that I didn't realize I was intentionally had to develop. And I think you need to develop. And it's a pity that I didn't, right, in my early years, right? So that it's really easy to talk from our point of view. It's so difficult to talk or see from your point of view or other point of view. I mean, it's easier for me to see from your point of view because I know you well, but it's harder for me to see from a person that I don't share the same narrative. Like that's where it kind of becomes really challenging, right? Whether that narrative is social, cultural, religious, whatever, right? So that becomes, so I think that really, that's why for me, like if you want to read one chapter, read Julia's chapter, which is really great because it does give you the understanding of empathy in a really broader context. And there is all these references that you can like look into from behavior science to like bias and, you know, the realistic conflict theory and all of that stuff because it applies to today. Like, I mean, I woke up, you know, I don't want to mention the election, but after that, I kind of like think about like, okay, breathe and think of empathy and see other perspectives. It's hard. Sorry. To your question along. Yes.
My question is really purely architectural here. Did you find that most of these projects are, I'll call them adaptive reuse projects? They are buildings that were built maybe as warehouses, certainly for other functions and other uses. Adapting those for a learning environment with empathy as a goal, did you find that as a canvas more advantageous or more challenging? Would it be harder with the clean piece of paper, or is like you look at a building and you have a perception of it because you know its history, now you've changed it, does that immediately psychologically get people's brain going into a different direction?
That's a great question. Well, actually, in the book, there is another example which I didn't put in here. It talks about time diaxis, and it talks about an architectural response to an existing landmark building, and how actually, as the architecture relates to that other building, it actually does it through time. And through time, and this is a colonial building, and you know it has a colonial sort of baggage with it, and this new expansion frames it in such ways that it sort of recontextualizes time in ways where you can actually look at that building beyond the baggage of the colonial past, but beyond, right? So I think, I mean, obviously there is one way to see that, like when you touch an existing building. So again, for the urban village of Shenzhen, the urban village itself is a very resilient typology, right? It sort of negotiates between a rural and sort of an agrarian past and a urban, and it's a specific typology. So when we were working on that definitely inspired us how to situate the learning in that particular context. So I think in that sense, I would say that being an existing context is incredibly important because almost the building suggests some kind of empathy with its context itself, right? In a more larger social context, right? So like you couldn't do that and say, I'm going to create a school that has 100 acres of land, beautifully gated around this fence and out there, versus this is like out there in the city. Like that bridge crosses the urban village and you know, like the school is integrated. There are other sort of people out there doing all kinds of other things. And that's kind of that, but it doesn't, I think we have developed ideas for ground up ideas. You can, I don't think it just is the land of the adaptive reuse. I mean, I love adaptive reuse. I mean, it's the perfect thing to do this time, you know, for us as architects to seriously think about it. But it's not the only mode.
Any other questions? Any last thoughts? What's the way forward?
must be repeating myself now. I think the way forward is to have empathy as a goal. I mean, I think that's probably the root problem, is trying to say what, we try to start with what problem are we trying to solve? And if empathy isn't one of the objectives, it's never going to be achieved. But it's a worthy objective along with others, and so I think making sure that it is a goal from the outset would be a change.
I think certainly you've all shown that having different voices from different fields and different perspectives is already a very productive start to considering how we develop empathy and the importance of that. And Aybars, as I think you've pointed out, it's more important than ever, if there ever was not an important point. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. Much more to come.